The blood-red sun hung low over Eagar, Arizona territory, casting long shadows across the dusty Main Street as Harriet Rowland stared at her husband's grave for the last time before winter would blanket it in snow. 1885 had been the cruelest year of her 26 years of life, taking Thomas with it when a mining accident crushed the breath from his body and left her alone with a small ranch, mounting debts, and memories that haunted her day and night. "I have to let you go," she whispered, placing a wildflower on the freshly carved headstone. The cemetery sat on a gentle slope overlooking the struggling settlement, the mountains rising majestically beyond. 6 months a widow, and Harriet still couldn't believe how quickly life had changed. One moment planning for their future, the next planning a funeral. The wind picked up, sending her black mourning dress fluttering against her legs as she made her way back to her wagon. The small ranch Thomas had been so proud of 5 miles outside of Eagar was becoming harder to maintain on her own. Whispers around town suggested she'd soon have to sell, but stubbornness kept her working from dawn till dusk, determined to hold onto the only thing left of their shared dreams. The wagon wheels creaked as she guided her aging mare down the rutted path toward town. She needed supplies and, more importantly, needed to speak with Mr. Finch at the bank about extending her loan. Again, the thought made her stomach twist with anxiety, but there was no avoiding it. Eagar wasn't much of a town, a main street with a general store, bank, saloon, small hotel, and a smattering of other buildings trying hard to look permanent in this harsh landscape. The Arizona territory still felt wild and untamed, even with statehood discussions growing louder each year. For now, it remained a place where fortunes could be made or lost on a turn of luck, and where a woman alone faced challenges at every turn. Harriet pulled up in front of Jensen's general store, tightening her bonnet strings against the persistent wind. Her dark hair, once worn proudly long when Thomas was alive, was now practically pinned beneath her widow's bonnet. The black clothing that marked her status felt like a brand, separating her from the life she once knew. "Mrs. Rowland," Mr. Jensen greeted her solemnly as she entered the store. The bell above the door announced her arrival, and several heads turned briefly before returning to their business. "What can I help you with today?" The usual Mr. Jensen. "Flour, coffee, a bit of sugar if you can spare it," she replied, mentally calculating how much she could afford. "And I need some new fence wire. The south pasture needs repair before winter." Jensen's bushy eyebrows rose slightly. "Fence mending, that's hardly work for a widow." Harriet completed his sentence, a slight edge to her voice. "I'm afraid the fence doesn't much care about my marital status, Mr. Jensen. It needs fixing all the same." The storekeeper nodded, embarrassment coloring his weathered face. "Of course, Mrs. Rowland, I'll gather your things." As Jensen moved about the store, Harriet glanced around at the other customers. Mrs. Whitman and her daughter were selecting fabrics, whispering excitedly about a coming social. 2 ranch hands were pricing ammunition, and at the back, examining a display of tools, stood a man she didn't recognize. He was tall, with broad shoulders tapering to a narrow waist. His clothes were trail-worn but neat denim pants, a faded blue shirt, and a dusty brown vest. The hat he wore was pushed back slightly, revealing a face tanned from long days in the sun. Not handsome in the conventional sense, but striking, with strong features and eyes that caught the light when he turned. He must have felt her gaze because he looked up suddenly, catching her in the act of staring. Instead of looking away as propriety demanded, Harriet found herself momentarily frozen, locked in the gaze of a stranger whose eyes seemed to see too much. He tipped his hat slightly, a small gesture of acknowledgement, and Harriet finally managed to look away, her cheeks warming. "That'll be $3.42, Jensen said, pulling her attention back to her purchases. She counted out the money carefully, aware that her funds were dwindling faster than she cared to admit. "You need help carrying these to your wagon, Mrs. Rowland?" Jensen asked, genuine concern in his voice. "No, thank you. I can manage," she replied, gathering the packages. Her pride wouldn't allow her to accept help she hadn't asked for, even as the weight strained her arms. As she pushed the door open with her shoulder, one of the smaller packages slipped from her grasp, hitting the wooden porch with a soft thud. Before she could set down her other bundles, a hand appeared, retrieving the fallen item. "Allow me," said a deep voice with the barest hint of a southern drawl. It was the stranger from inside, now standing beside her with her package in his outstretched hand. Up close, Harriet could see the fine lines around his eyes, suggesting he was in his early 30s. His eyes were an unusual shade of gray-blue, like the sky before a storm. "Thank you," she said stiffly, trying to take the package without dropping the others. "I don't believe we've met," he said, making no move to hand over the package. "Owen Kincaid, Mrs. Harriet Rowland," she replied, emphasizing the Mrs. slightly. Even after 6 months, she found comfort in the title that connected her to Thomas, though it also served as a shield against unwanted attention. "Would you allow me to help you with these to your wagon, Mrs. Rowland?" he asked, already reaching for her other packages. "That's not necessary, Mr. Kincaid. I've managed on my own these past months, and I expect I'll continue to do so," Harriet replied, her voice cooler than intended. Something flickered in his eyes, understanding, perhaps, or recognition of the pride that straightened her spine despite the weight in her arms. "I don't doubt your capability, Mrs. Rowland," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "But accepting help when offered doesn't diminish your independence. It simply means you're wise enough to conserve your strength for battles that matter more." His unexpected response caught her off guard, and before she could formulate a reply, he had carefully taken the heaviest packages from her arms, leaving her with only the lightest ones. "Your wagon?" he asked, nodding toward the street. Harriet sighed, defeated by logic and admittedly relieved to be unburdened of the weight. "The one with the gray mare," she directed, following him down the steps. They walked in silence to her wagon, where Owen placed the packages carefully in the back, arranging them so they wouldn't shift during the journey home. "New to Eagar?" Harriet asked, unable to contain her curiosity despite her determination to remain aloof. "Arrived yesterday," he confirmed. "Taking over as foreman at the Circle H Ranch. Mr. Henderson's getting on in years, needs someone to manage the day-to-day." Harriet nodded. The Circle H was one of the largest ranches in the area, about 15 miles north of town. "Henderson's a fair man. Helped my husband and me when we first arrived." "Your ranch is nearby?" Owen asked, helping her secure the last package. 5 miles southwest of town, nothing grand, 40 acres, a small herd." She paused, wondering why she was sharing these details with a stranger. "It was my husband's dream to build something of our own." The past tense hung in the air between them. "I'm sorry for your loss," Owen said quietly, genuine sympathy in his voice. Harriet nodded, unable to speak for a moment. "Thank you for your help, Mr. Kincaid," she said finally, climbing onto the wagon seat. "Welcome to Eagar, Mrs. Rowland," he said, stepping back and tipping his hat again. "I hope our paths cross again." She flicked the reins, setting the mare in motion, oddly unsettled by the brief encounter. It had been so long since she'd had a conversation with a man that wasn't tinged with pity or focused on business matters. Owen Kincaid had spoken to her as a person, not just a widow, and something about that felt both refreshing and dangerous. The bank was her next stop, and the thought of it drove all other considerations from her mind. Mr. Finch was waiting, his tight smile failing to reach his eyes as she entered his office. "Mrs. Rowland, punctual as always," he said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "I've been reviewing your situation." The next 20 minutes were an exercise in humiliation as Finch outlined, in clinical terms, just how precarious her position had become. The mine had provided only a small death benefit, most of which had gone to pay off Thomas's medical bills and funeral expenses. The ranch was mortgaged, and the payments were 3 months in arrears. "I can give you until the end of winter, Mrs. Rowland, but no longer," Finch concluded. "If you haven't found a way to meet your obligations by then, I'm afraid we'll have to foreclose." Harriet sat perfectly still, refusing to let him see how his words had shaken her. "I understand," she said evenly. "The winter stock should fetch a good price in spring." "Perhaps," Finch said doubtfully. "But even then, it may not be enough. Have you considered selling?" There are several interested parties. You could settle your debts and have enough left to start fresh, perhaps return east to your family." "I have no family east or west, Mr. Finch," Harriet replied, "and I'm not selling, not yet. My husband believed in that land and I won't let it go without a fight." Finch sighed, clearly having expected this response. "Very well, Mrs. Rowland, until spring then." As Harriet left the bank, the weight of her situation settled over her like a heavy blanket. The ranch had never been particularly profitable, but they had been making progress before Thomas's death. Now, without his strength and knowledge, she was fighting a losing battle against nature, finances, and time itself. The ride home was long and quiet, giving Harriet too much time with her thoughts. The land stretched out around her, beautiful in its harsh way, sagebrush and juniper dotting the landscape, mountains rising in the distance, the late afternoon sun painting everything in shades of gold and amber. Despite everything, she loved this place, this wild, unforgiving country that had captured Thomas's heart and, eventually, her own. The ranch came into view as she crested the last hill, a small cabin with a barn and corral, nestled against a stand of pines. A thin column of smoke rose from the chimney, signaling that Mrs. Tanner, the neighbor's widow who sometimes helped with chores, had been by to stoke the fire. It wasn't much, but it was home, and the thought of losing it made Harriet's throat tighten with emotion. As she pulled up to the barn, she noticed something amiss. The corral gate was open, and their small herd of cattle was nowhere to be seen. Panic flared in her chest as she jumped down from the wagon, scanning the property. Had rustlers come while she was in town? It wouldn't be the first time outlaws had targeted a widow's ranch, assuming it would be easy pickings. Then she heard the distant lowing of cattle and the sound of hooves. Relief washed over her as she saw the herd being driven toward the corral from the south pasture, but confusion quickly followed. Who was bringing them in? As the dust cleared, she saw a familiar figure on horseback, directing the last of the cattle into the corral. Owen Kincaid closed the gate behind them, dismounting with the ease of a man who'd spent most of his life in the saddle. "Mr. Kincaid," Harriet called, striding toward him. "What are you doing on my property?" He turned, wiping his brow with his sleeve. "Mrs. Rowland, I hope you don't mind." "I was riding out to the Circle H and noticed your fence was down and your cattle were wandering. Thought I'd round them up for you before they strayed too far." Harriet looked past him to the corral, counting quickly. All 12 head were there, plus the 2 calves born in spring. "You rounded up my entire herd by yourself," Owen shrugged. "It's a small herd and they weren't too scattered. Your south fence has about 20 feet down, though. Looks like a tree came down on it in that storm last week." Harriet sighed, adding this new problem to her mental list of repairs. "Thank you for bringing them in. That was very neighborly of you." "Just doing what anyone would," he replied, though they both knew that wasn't necessarily true. Many in his position would have ridden past, considering it none of their business. An awkward silence fell between them, broken only by the sounds of the cattle settling in the corral. "Well, I should get going," Owen said finally, mounting his horse. "Mr. Henderson is expecting me and I'm already late." "Of course," Harriet nodded. "Thank you again, Mr. Kincaid." He tipped his hat. "Mrs. Rowland." Then, almost as an afterthought, he added, "That fence won't fix itself and those cattle will be out again at first light. If you'd allow it, I could ride back tomorrow after my duties at the Circle H and help you repair it." Harriet's first instinct was to refuse. She'd managed for 6 months on her own, making repairs, tending the herd, keeping the ranch afloat through sheer determination. Accepting help felt like admitting defeat, like acknowledging that Thomas had been right when he'd worried about leaving her alone. But the fence needed fixing, and doing it alone would take her days she couldn't spare. "That would be appreciated," she said finally, the words feeling strange on her tongue. "But I insist on paying you for your time." Owen shook his head. "No payment necessary. Consider it an investment in being a good neighbor." Before she could argue, he touched his heels to his horse's flanks and rode away, leaving Harriet standing in the yard, watching his retreating figure until he disappeared over the hill. That night, as she sat alone by the fire, Harriet found her thoughts returning to the mysterious new foreman of the Circle H. There was something about Owen Kincaid that unsettled her. though she couldn't quite put her finger on what it was. Perhaps it was simply that he was the first man since Thomas's death who had treated her as something other than an object of pity or a business problem to be solved. She pushed the thoughts away, focusing instead on the ledger open on her lap. The columns of numbers told a grim story, one of dwindling resources and mounting debt. If she couldn't find a way to increase her income or decrease her expenses, Finch would have his foreclosure by spring. Outside, the wind picked up, moaning around the eaves of the cabin like a restless spirit. Winter was coming, and with it, the hardest test of her resolve yet. True to his word, Owen Kincaid arrived the next afternoon, riding up to the cabin with a wagon loaded with fence posts and wire. Harriet, who had spent the morning mucking out stalls in the barn, straightened her back and wiped her hands on her apron as he approached. "Mr. Kincaid," she greeted him, pushing a strand of hair back from her face. "I didn't expect you to bring supplies." "Found these at the Circle H, just gathering dust," he explained, jumping down from the wagon. "Henderson said I could put them to good use." Harriet frowned. "I can't accept charity, Mr. Kincaid." "It's not charity, Mrs. Rowland. It's neighborly cooperation," Owen replied patiently. "The Circle H has more supplies than it needs, and your fence needs fixing. Simple as that." Before she could argue further, he began unloading the wagon. "Where are your tools?" Realizing that resistance was futile, Harriet sighed and pointed toward the barn. "In there, I'll show you." Together, they gathered what they needed and headed for the south pasture. The fallen tree that had damaged the fence was massive, a ponderosa pine that must have been weakened by disease before the storm brought it down. "This is going to be quite a job," Owen observed, surveying the damage. "The tree will need to be cleared before we can even start on the fence." "I've been working on it bit by bit," Harriet admitted, pointing to where she had already managed to saw through some of the smaller branches. "But it's slow going." Owen nodded, removing his coat and rolling up his sleeves. "Well, let's get to it then." For the next several hours, they worked side by side, Owen with the axe, making short work of the branches Harriet had been struggling with for days. She worked alongside him, clearing debris and helping to roll the cut sections away from the fence line. By mid-afternoon, they had cleared enough of the tree to begin repairing the actual fence. As they worked, conversation flowed more easily than Harriet would have expected. Owen told her about growing up on a small farm in Tennessee, his time serving in the cavalry during the latter part of the Civil War, though he spoke little of the fighting itself, and his years working as a ranch hand and eventually foreman on increasingly larger spreads throughout the West. "What brought you to Arizona?" Harriet asked as she handed him another length of wire. "Opportunity," he replied, threading the wire through the post, "and a desire for something new. I've been moving around for most of my life, never staying in one place too long. Thought it might be time to put down some roots. And you chose Eagar. Most people would consider that an unusual choice for setting down roots." Owen smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his face. "I like unusual choices, Mrs. Rowland. The expected path isn't always the right one." There was something in the way he said it that made Harriet wonder if he was speaking about more than just his decision to come to Arizona. "What about you?" he asked. "How did you and your husband end up here?" Harriet's hands stilled for a moment before she continued working. "Thomas read about the mining opportunities and the available land. He was always full of dreams, always certain the next venture would be the one to secure our future." Her voice softened with the memories. "We came from Colorado 3 years ago, bought this land, started building the herd. Thomas took work at the mine to supplement our income until the ranch could support us fully." "He sounds like a good man," Owen said quietly. "He was," Harriet agreed, surprising herself with how easily she could speak of Thomas now. Usually the pain was too raw, too close to the surface. "He was kind and hardworking, always believed tomorrow would be better than today." "A valuable perspective," Owen commented, securing the last section of fence. "There, that should hold your cattle, at least until the next tree decides to fall." Harriet stepped back to admire their handiwork. The repaired fence was sturdy, far better than she could have managed on her own. "Thank you, Mr. Kincaid. This would have taken me weeks." "Owen," he said, wiping his brow with his sleeve, "if we're going to be neighbors, you might as well use my given name." Harriet hesitated. Such familiarity seemed inappropriate for a widow of only 6 months, but there was nothing improper in his suggestion, merely the practical acknowledgement that formality grew tiresome among neighbors who might need to rely on each other. "Very well. Owen," she said, testing the name. "And you may call me Harriet, though I suspect most in town will continue to refer to me as Widow Rowland for the foreseeable future." A shadow crossed Owen's face at her words. "People can be too quick to define others by their circumstances rather than their character," he said. "You're more than your widowhood, Harriet." The simple statement, spoken without pity or condescension, struck Harriet with unexpected force. For 6 months, her identity had been consumed by her loss, both in her own mind and in the eyes of others. To be seen as something more, as someone with an existence independent of her tragedy, felt like drawing a full breath after being underwater. "Thank you," she said quietly, uncertain how to respond to his insight. Owen seemed to sense her discomfort and changed the subject. "It's getting late. I should head back to the Circle H before Henderson thinks I've abandoned him on my second day." They gathered the tools in companionable silence, loading them into Harriet's barn before Owen hitched his horse back to the wagon. "Will you be all right with the rest of your chores?" he asked, glancing around the ranch. "There's still daylight left. I could stay a bit longer if you need help with anything else." "No, thank you. You've done more than enough," Harriet assured him. "The evening chores are light." Owen nodded, climbing onto the wagon seat. "If you need anything, the Circle H isn't far. Don't hesitate to send word." "I won't," Harriet promised, though they both knew her pride would make such a request unlikely. "Thank you again, Owen." He tipped his hat and clicked to the horses, setting the wagon in motion. Harriet watched until he disappeared from view, surprised by the strange emptiness that settled over her as the sound of the wagon faded into the distance. For a few hours, the ranch hadn't felt quite so lonely, the burden not quite so heavy. Shaking off the feeling, she turned back to the cabin. There was still work to be done before darkness fell, and dwelling on Owen Kincaid's unexpected kindness would not get her chores finished. The days grew shorter as November deepened, and winter's chill settled over the land. Harriet fell into her usual routine, rising before dawn, tending the animals, mending equipment, preparing for the cold months ahead. She saw little of Owen Kincaid in the weeks following the fence repair, though she heard news of him in town during her infrequent visits. By all accounts, he was proving himself a capable foreman at the Circle H, implementing changes that had old Henderson singing his praises to anyone who would listen. Harriet found herself oddly pleased by these reports, though she tried not to examine that feeling too closely. It was during the first real snowfall of the season that their paths crossed again. Harriet had driven into town for supplies, wanting to stock up before the roads became impassable. The snow had started as light flurries while she was in Jensen's store, but had intensified alarmingly by the time she loaded her purchases into the wagon. "You shouldn't attempt the journey home in this, Mrs. Rowland," Jensen advised, concern evident in his voice. "It's turning into a proper blizzard. Stay at the hotel tonight and head back when it clears." Harriet shook her head, gazing anxiously at the thickening snowfall. "I can't leave the animals unattended overnight, Mr. Jensen. They're depending on me." "Then at least wait a bit, see if it eases," he suggested. But after an hour of watching from Jensen's window, it became clear that the storm was only worsening. With a sense of dread, Harriet thanked the storekeeper for his hospitality and wrapped her shawl tightly around her, pulling her hat down as far as it would go before stepping out into the swirling white. The 5-mile journey home had never seemed so daunting. Visibility was poor, the wind driving snow into her face as she urged the reluctant mare forward. The normally well-defined road was rapidly disappearing beneath a blanket of white, and Harriet found herself relying more on memory than sight to guide her. They had traveled perhaps 2 miles when disaster struck. A sudden gust of wind spooked the mare, causing her to rear and jerk sideways. The wagon lurched, and Harriet felt a sickening crack as the right wheel hit something hidden beneath the snow, a rock or stump. The wheel gave way, and the wagon tilted precariously before coming to rest at an angle, partially in a ditch. Harriet managed to calm the frightened horse, but a quick inspection confirmed her fears the wheel was broken beyond her ability to repair it, especially in these conditions. She was stranded, 3 miles from home, in a worsening blizzard for a moment. Panic threatened to overwhelm her. Then her practical nature reasserted itself. She couldn't stay with the wagon, the temperature was dropping rapidly, and she had no means of making a fire. Her only option was to unhitch the mare and ride her home, abandoning the supplies until the storm passed. Her fingers, already numb with cold, struggled with the harness buckles. The wind howled around her, driving snow into every fold of her clothing despite her layers. Finally, she managed to free the mare from the wagon, but as she prepared to mount, another problem presented itself without a proper saddle. Staying on the horse's back through the blinding snow would be nearly impossible. It was in this moment of despair that Harriet heard the muffled sound of hoofbeats approaching through the storm. She strained her eyes, trying to see through the curtain of white. Was it a traveler, or perhaps something more sinister? Alone and vulnerable, she suddenly realized how defenseless she was. The figure that emerged from the swirling snow was almost ghost-like at first, a dark shape gradually taking form. Relief flooded through Harriet as she recognized the broad shoulders and the way the rider sat his horse. Owen. She called, her voice nearly lost in the wind. He was at her side in moments, dismounting with a grace that belied the treacherous conditions. "Harriet, are you hurt?" His voice was tight with concern as he quickly assessed the situation. "No, just stranded," she replied, teeth chattering with cold. "The wheel broke. I was trying to ride Daisy home, but without a saddle." Owen nodded, understanding immediately. "You'd never make it." He glanced at the broken wagon, making a quick decision. "Leave the supplies. We need to get you somewhere warm before this gets worse." "But my ranch is too far in these conditions," Owen cut her off. "The Circle H is less than a mile from here. We'll shelter there until the storm passes." Harriet wanted to protest, to insist on returning to her own property, but the cold was seeping into her bones, and even her stubborn pride couldn't deny the logic of his suggestion. She nodded, surrendering to necessity. Owen helped her secure Daisy's reins to his saddle horn, then, without warning, lifted Harriet onto his own horse before mounting behind her. The sudden proximity was shocking, his chest solid against her back, his arms encircling her as he reached for the reins. It had been so long since she'd been this close to another person, let alone a man, that Harriet found herself momentarily disoriented by the sensation. "Hold tight," Owen instructed, urging his horse forward into the storm. The journey to the Circle H seemed both interminable and strangely dreamlike. The world had narrowed to the small cocoon of warmth created by Owen's body behind hers, the steady movement of the horse beneath them, and the relentless white of the storm. Harriet, exhausted and chilled to the bone, found herself leaning back into Owen's strength, grateful for the solid presence keeping her upright. When the main house of the Circle H finally came into view, its windows glowing with welcoming light, Harriet could have wept with relief. Owen guided the horses to the barn first, where a young stable hand appeared to take charge of the animals. "Get them dried off and fed, Jimmy," Owen instructed. "And make sure Mrs. Rowland's mare is well tended. She's had a rough go of it." "Yes, sir, Mr. Kincaid," the boy replied, eyeing Harriet curiously. Owen helped Harriet dismount, supporting her when her legs threatened to buckle beneath her. "Let's get you inside and warm," he murmured, guiding her toward the main house. The Circle H was one of the oldest and largest ranches in the area. Its main house, a substantial 2-story structure that spoke of prosperity and permanence. As they stomped snow from their boots on the porch, the door swung open to reveal an elderly man with white hair and a face lined by years in the sun. Kincaid was beginning to worry. The man stopped, noticing Harriet for the first time. "Mrs. Rowland, good heavens, you look half frozen." "Mr. Henderson," Harriet greeted the ranch owner, embarrassed to be seen in such a state. "I apologize for the intrusion." "Nonsense, girl, get in here by the fire." Henderson stepped back, ushering them inside. "Rosa," he called, "we need hot coffee and blankets." The next hour passed in a blur as Harriet was settled in a chair near the roaring fireplace, wrapped in blankets, and plied with hot coffee laced with whiskey. Rosa, Henderson's housekeeper, fussed over her like a mother hen, insisting she change into dry clothes a dress belonging to Henderson's daughter who occasionally visited from Phoenix. Once Harriet was warm and dry, the full awkwardness of the situation settled over her. Here she was, a widow alone in a house of men, dependent on their charity. It was precisely the kind of vulnerability she had fought so hard to avoid these past months. "I should return home as soon as the storm lets up," she said, setting her empty cup aside. "My animals need tending." Owen, who had been conferring quietly with Henderson near the window, turned to her. "The storm's not letting up anytime soon. Looks like it's settled in for the night, maybe longer." Harriet's heart sank. "But my cattle, the chickens," Jimmy rode out to alert the hands in the south bunkhouse. Henderson interjected. "I've sent 2 of my best men to your place to check on your stock. They'll feed and water everything and make sure all's secure." Harriet stared at the old rancher, momentarily speechless at this unexpected kindness. "Mr. Henderson, I don't know what to say. That's incredibly generous." Henderson waved away her thanks. "Been ranching in this valley for 30 years, Mrs. Rowland. We look out for each other out here." "Your Thomas would have done the same for any of us." The mention of Thomas brought a familiar pang, but Harriet managed a grateful smile. "Yes, he would have, thank you." "Now," Henderson continued, "you'll stay here tonight. Rosa's already preparing the guest room. Tomorrow, if the storm's passed, Owen will see you safely home." It was not a suggestion, but a statement of fact, delivered in a tone that brooked no argument. Harriet, recognizing the futility of protest and genuinely grateful for the shelter, merely nodded her acceptance. Dinner that evening was surprisingly pleasant. Henderson proved to be an engaging host, full of stories about the early days of the Arizona Territory. Owen was quieter, contributing occasionally to the conversation, but mostly observing with those keen gray-blue eyes that seemed to miss nothing. After dinner, Henderson excused himself, claiming the need for his old bones to rest. Rosa had already retired to her quarters off the kitchen, leaving Harriet and Owen alone in the parlor, the fire crackling companionably in the hearth. "Thank you," Harriet said into the silence, "for finding me today. I'm not sure what would have happened if you hadn't come along." Owen, standing by the mantel, looked down at her with an unreadable expression. "What were you doing out in that storm?" The question held no accusation, merely curiosity, but Harriet felt defensive nonetheless. "I needed supplies. The storm wasn't nearly so bad when I left town. You could have stayed in Eagar overnight and leave my animals untended. Would you abandon your responsibilities so easily?" Harriet challenged. A smile tugged at the corner of Owen's mouth. "Fair point, still it was a risk." "Life is full of risks, Mr. Kincaid. Some are simply more worth taking than others." Owen studied her for a long moment. "You're an unusual woman, Harriet Rowland, because I care for my animals. Because you face your challenges head-on without complaint or self-pity," he replied. "Not many would continue fighting as you have, alone against the odds." Harriet looked away, uncomfortable with his assessment. "I'm simply doing what needs to be done. There's no virtue in necessity." "There's virtue in perseverance, in maintaining dignity through hardship," Owen countered. He hesitated, then added, "Henderson told me about your situation with the bank." Harriet's head snapped up, mortification flooding her. "That's private business, Mr. Kincaid." "Owen," he reminded her gently, "and in a community this small, there are few truly private matters. Henderson mentioned it only because he respects your determination. Many in your position would have sold out months ago." "Is that what you think I should do? Sell the ranch and return east like some defeated pioneer?" Harriet demanded, the embers of her pride flaring. "I think," Owen said carefully, "that there's no shame in recognizing when a battle can't be won alone. It doesn't mean surrender, it means finding allies." Harriet fell silent, absorbing his words. The fire popped and hissed, sending sparks up the chimney as the wind continued to howl outside, rattling the windows in their frames. "I should retire," she said finally, rising from her chair. "It's been a long day." Owen straightened, stepping aside to clear her path to the stairs. "Of course." "Sleep well, Harriet." As she passed him, he added quietly, "Whatever you decide about the ranch, don't let pride be the deciding factor. It's a poor companion on a cold night." Harriet paused, struck by the personal note in his voice, as though he spoke from experience. She looked up at him, suddenly aware of how close they were standing, of the warmth radiating from him, of the gentle strength in his weathered face. "Good night, Owen," she whispered, then hurried up the stairs, her heart beating an unfamiliar rhythm in her chest. The storm raged through the night and well into the next day, making travel impossible. Harriet found herself an unexpected guest at the Circle H for a second night, though Henderson and Rosa went out of their way to make her feel welcome rather than stranded. By the morning of the third day, the storm had passed, leaving the landscape transformed beneath a pristine blanket of white. The sky was a clear, brilliant blue, the air sharp and clean in a way that made every breath invigorating. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Owen said, joining Harriet on the porch where she stood admiring the view. "First real snow of the season always feels like a fresh start." Harriet nodded, pulling her borrowed shawl tighter against the chill. "It does, though it also means harder work and longer days." "True enough," Owen agreed. "Henderson's men returned from your place yesterday evening while you were resting. They said all was well, animals fed and watered, buildings secure. But they also mentioned your roof could use some attention before the next storm." Harriet sighed. Another repair to add to her growing list. "I'll see to it when I get home." Owen regarded her thoughtfully. "I could help. The Circle H can spare me for a day or two." "You've already done more than enough," Harriet protested, though the offer was tempting. A leaking roof would make the cabin uninhabitable, and roof repair was not something she could manage alone. "Henderson actually suggested it," Owen said. "He has great respect for you, you know. Says you remind him of his late wife's same determination and spirit." Harriet was touched by the comparison. Henderson's wife had been legendary in the valley for her strength and capability, helping to build the Circle H from nothing in the early days of the territory. "That's quite a compliment," she said softly. "So you'll accept my help?" Owen pressed. Harriet hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, thank you." The journey back to her ranch was easier than Harriet had anticipated. Henderson had insisted on lending her his sleigh, a practical vehicle for the snow-covered roads, and Owen drove with a confidence that made the treacherous conditions seem manageable. As they approached her property, Harriet felt a mixture of relief and trepidation. Relief to be returning to her own space, her own responsibilities, trepidation at what awaited her there after the storm. The ranch looked smaller somehow, more vulnerable beneath its coating of snow. The broken wagon had been retrieved and stood near the barn, a visible reminder of her close call. But the animals greeted them with enthusiastic sounds, clearly well tended during her absence, and the cabin stood solid against the white landscape. Inside, the cabin was cold but undamaged. Owen set about building a fire while Harriet checked her supplies and assessed what had been used during her absence. The Circle H men had been considerate, using only what was necessary and leaving everything neat and orderly. As warmth slowly returned to the small space, Harriet found herself watching Owen as he moved about her home with unexpected ease, as if he belonged there. It was a disquieting thought, one that brought a flush to her cheeks when he caught her staring. "Everything all right?" he asked. "Yes," she replied quickly. It's strange having someone else here. I've grown accustomed to solitude." Owen nodded, understanding in his eyes. "I know the feeling. Spent many years with only my horse for company between jobs." He glanced around the cabin. "This is a good place, Harriet." "Solid, built with care." Thomas was meticulous, Harriet agreed, smiling at the memory. "Measured everything 3 times, always searching for the best materials even when we could barely afford them." "He built it to last," Owen observed. "Be ashamed to lose it." The gentle reminder of her precarious situation stung, but Harriet couldn't deny the truth of it. "Yes, it would," she admitted quietly. "Have you considered taking on a partner?" Owen asked, the question so unexpected that Harriet nearly dropped the cup she was holding. "A partner," she repeated. "Someone to share the workload, the expenses," Owen clarified. "Many widows in your situation have found such arrangements beneficial." Harriet set the cup down carefully. "Are you suggesting I remarry Mr. Kincaid? Because I assure you that is not a solution I'm prepared to consider." Owen looked startled, then embarrassed. No, that's not I meant a business partner, someone to invest in the ranch, share the labor and the profits. Nothing more personal than that. It was Harriet's turn to feel embarrassed, her assumption revealing more about her state of mind than she cared to admit. Oh, I misunderstood. Although, Owen continued, a thoughtful look crossing his face, marriage has been the solution for many in similar circumstances. It's a practical approach to a practical problem. Perhaps for some, Harriet replied stiffly, but I'm not interested in a marriage of convenience. Thomas and I married for love, Mr. Kincaid. I won't dishonor that memory by treating marriage as a business transaction. Of course, Owen nodded. I meant no offense. An awkward silence fell between them, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the occasional sound from the animals outside. I should check the roof, Owen said finally, clearly eager to escape the uncomfortable conversation. See what repairs are needed. Yes, of course, Harriet agreed, equally relieved by the change of subject. There are tools in the barn. For the remainder of the day, they worked separately, Owen on the roof, Harriet tending to indoor chores that had accumulated during her absence. The distance helped ease the tension, and by evening a more comfortable atmosphere had been restored. Over a simple dinner of stew made from preserved vegetables and the last of Harriet's cured ham, Owen reported on the roof's condition. It needs work, but it's not as bad as I feared. With good weather tomorrow, I can make the repairs needed to get you through winter. Come spring, you'll want to consider a more thorough overhaul. If I'm still here in spring, Harriet murmured, the reality of her situation never far from her thoughts. Owen studied her across the table. You really don't want to sell, do you? Harriet shook her head. This land was Thomas's dream. Selling feels like giving up on that dream, on everything we worked for together. But holding on to it at all costs, is that what Thomas would want? For you to struggle alone until you're left with nothing? The question cut deep, forcing Harriet to confront a truth she had been avoiding. Would Thomas want her to cling to the property at the expense of her own well-being? Or would he want her to find a way forward, even if it meant letting go of what they had built together? I don't know, she admitted, her voice barely audible. I only know that the thought of leaving feels like losing him all over again. Owen's expression softened with understanding. The land isn't Thomas, Harriet. Your memories of him, your love for him, those go with you wherever you are. Tears welled in Harriet's eyes, unexpected and unwelcome. She looked away, embarrassed by this display of emotion in front of a man who was still, essentially, a stranger. It's getting late, she said, rising abruptly from the table. You should return to the Circle H. Owen didn't move. In this darkness, with the roads still treacherous, that would be foolish. Harriet froze, suddenly aware of the implications. A widow and an unmarried man, alone in a remote cabin, it was the stuff of scandal, regardless of the innocent circumstances. I can sleep in the barn, Owen suggested, reading her concern. It's warm enough there with the animals. Don't be ridiculous, Harriet found herself saying. The temperature will drop well below freezing tonight. I won't have you risking pneumonia on my account. She gestured to Thomas's old chair near the fire. You can sleep here. I'll bring blankets. It was Owen's turn to look uncomfortable. Are you certain? Your reputation, my reputation, is already that of an eccentric widow too stubborn to know when she's defeated, Harriet replied with unexpected frankness. I doubt it could suffer much more damage. Besides, who's to know? We're miles from the nearest neighbor. Owen nodded slowly. If you're sure. I am, Harriet affirmed, though her heart was beating faster than normal. It's the practical solution, as you might say. That night, separated by the thin wall between the main room and Harriet's small bedroom, both lay awake longer than either would admit, aware of the other's presence in a way that transcended the physical space between them. Harriet stared at the ceiling, listening to the occasional creak of Thomas's chair as Owen shifted position. What was she doing, allowing this man into her home, her life? A man she barely knew, yet who had already seen her at her most vulnerable, stranded in a blizzard, facing financial ruin, admitting to doubts about her ability to continue alone. In the main room, Owen gazed into the dying embers of the fire, thinking about the woman behind the wall. Her strength impressed him, but it was her vulnerability, carefully hidden beneath layers of pride and determination that moved him. Harriet Rowland was fighting a battle she couldn't win alone, yet she continued to refuse most offers of help, determined to stand or fall on her own terms. It reminded him painfully of another strong-willed individual himself. Years ago, too proud to accept assistance when it was offered, too certain he could handle everything alone. That pride had cost him dearly, a lesson he had learned the hard way. Morning brought renewed purpose and a tacit agreement to avoid the more personal aspects of the previous evening's conversation. Owen set to work on the roof while Harriet tackled her regular chores, the routine of ranch life providing a comforting structure to the day. By mid-afternoon, Owen had completed the most critical repairs. "That should hold through winter," he announced as he climbed down the ladder. "But like I said, come spring you'll want to if I'm still here," Harriet completed his sentence, a sad smile touching her lips. Owen brushed dust from his hands, regarding her thoughtfully. "You know, there might be another solution we haven't considered." "Oh," Harriet raised an eyebrow. "Henderson mentioned the Circle H is looking to expand its grazing land. Your property borders his southern pastures. What if, instead of selling to strangers or the bank, you considered selling to the Circle H? Henderson would give you a fair price." Harriet considered this. Selling to Henderson would at least ensure the land went to someone who would appreciate it, someone Thomas had respected. "It's worth considering," she admitted, "though it doesn't solve the immediate problem of where I would go or what I would do." Henderson also mentioned needing help with the ranch accounts, Owen continued. "His eyesight isn't what it was, and numbers were never his strength. You're educated, good with figures from what I've seen in your ledgers. You could stay on, work for the Circle H, perhaps even live in the foreman's cabin once it's repaired." The suggestion was so unexpected, so perfectly practical, that Harriet was momentarily speechless. It would allow her to remain in the area, to still see the land she and Thomas had loved, while providing both income and a place to live. I'll think about it," she said finally. Owen nodded, satisfied that she hadn't rejected the idea outright. "Good, that's all I ask." As the sun began its early winter descent, Owen prepared to return to the Circle H. Henderson had indeed loaned them a sleigh, which would make the journey safer in the lingering snow. "I can't thank you enough for everything you've done," Harriet said as they stood in the yard, the horses stamping impatiently in their traces. "No thanks necessary," Owen replied. "That's what neighbors do," Harriet smiled. "Is that all we are, neighbors?" The question surprised them both, hanging in the air between them like the steam of their breath in the cold air. Owen's expression grew serious. "I'd like to think we're friends, Harriet, and perhaps in time." He left the sentence unfinished, the implication clear in his eyes. Harriet looked away, unnerved by the direction of her own thoughts. "Safe journey, Owen," she said softly. He tipped his hat, a gesture that had become familiar in their brief acquaintance. "I'll come by next week to check on that roof, make sure it's holding, if that's all right with you." "Yes," Harriet nodded. "That would be appreciated." As the sleigh disappeared down the snow-covered road, Harriet stood watching long after it had gone from sight, her mind a tumult of conflicting emotions. For the first time since Thomas's death, she found herself thinking of the future as something other than a continuation of her present struggle, and that, more than anything, was both terrifying and strangely exhilarating. The weeks that followed brought a new rhythm to Harriet's life. True to his word, Owen visited regularly, ostensibly to check on the roof repairs but increasingly to assist with other tasks around the ranch. Sometimes he brought news or messages from Henderson, whose offer regarding the property remained open. December arrived, bringing with it preparations for Christmas. Eagar transformed under garlands of pine and homemade decorations, the small community determined to celebrate despite the hardships of frontier life. Harriet found herself drawn into the festivities more than she had expected, agreeing to help with the church social and even contributing some of her precious sugar for the communal baking. It was during one such gathering, as she arranged cookies on a platter in the church meeting room, that Mrs. Tanner approached her. "You're looking well, Harriet," the older woman observed. "There's color in your cheeks again." "The cold brings it out," Harriet replied, deflecting the implied compliment. Mrs. Tanner smiled knowingly. Perhaps, or perhaps it's the company you've been keeping. Mr. Kincaid seems a fine man. Harriet's hands stilled. Mr. Kincaid has been kind enough to assist with some repairs on my property, nothing more. Of course, Mrs. Tanner nodded, clearly unconvinced. Still, it does a heart good to see you engaging with life again. Thomas would approve, you know. He wouldn't want you to be alone forever. Before Harriet could formulate a response, Mrs. Tanner patted her arm and moved away, leaving her to ponder the older woman's words. Was she engaging with life again? Had she, without realizing it, begun to emerge from the shroud of grief that had enveloped her for so long? Later that evening, as the social wound down, Harriet found herself unexpectedly sharing the ride home with Owen, who had attended at Henderson's insistence. Henderson thinks it's important for the Circle H to be represented at community events, Owen explained as he helped Harriet into the sleigh. Though I suspect he also thought I could use some socializing. And could you? Harriet asked, settling the blanket over her lap. Owen smiled, the expression transforming his usually serious face. Perhaps, though I found myself watching the clock, wondering when it would be appropriate to offer you a ride home. The admission, spoken casually as he took his seat beside her, sent an unexpected warmth through Harriet that had nothing to do with the blanket. The journey to her ranch was familiar now, but tonight it felt different. Perhaps it was the lingering festivity of the social, or the clarity of the star-filled sky above them, or simply the companionable silence that had developed between them over the past weeks. As they approached her cabin, Harriet found herself reluctant for the evening to end. "Would you like to come in for coffee?" she asked impulsively. "It's still early." Owen glanced at her, surprise evident in his expression before it softened into pleasure. "I'd like that very much." Inside the cabin, warmed by the fire Harriet had banked before leaving for the social, they shed their heavy coats and settled into what had become their usual positions, Harriet in her small rocking chair, Owen in what had once been Thomas's chair but which she had, without quite acknowledging it, begun to think of as Owen's. As she prepared coffee on the small stove, Harriet was struck by how comfortable this felt, having Owen in her home, moving about her kitchen, sharing the quiet end of a pleasant day. It was a domesticity she had not experienced since Thomas's death, a simple pleasure she had not allowed herself to miss until now, when its absence was suddenly filled. "I spoke with Finch yesterday," she said as she handed Owen his cup, "about Henderson's offer." Owen looked up, surprise evident in his face. "And he thinks it's a good solution. The price Henderson is offering would clear my debt with the bank and leave enough for a fresh start, and the position managing the Circle H accounts would provide steady income. So you're considering it?" Owen asked carefully. Harriet nodded, settling into her chair. "I am. It makes sense, practically speaking, and yet, you still feel like you're abandoning Thomas's dream," Owen finished for her. "Yes," Harriet admitted. "Though I've been thinking about what you said, that Thomas would want me to find a way forward, even if it meant letting go of the ranch." Owen was silent for a moment, sipping his coffee thoughtfully. "May I speak plainly, Harriet?" she nodded, curious about his sudden seriousness. "I didn't know Thomas, but from everything you've told me about him, he sounds like a man who loved you deeply, who wanted the best for you." Owen leaned forward, his gray-blue eyes intent on hers. "If he were here now, seeing you struggle alone, watching you exhaust yourself trying to maintain a property that's slowly draining away your resources and your spirit, what would he say?" Harriet considered the question, trying to imagine what Thomas would advise if he could see her situation clearly. "He would tell me to be practical," she said finally, "to make the decision that offers the best chance for happiness, not just survival." "And what decision is that, Harriet?" Owen asked softly. She looked up, meeting his gaze directly. I think it's time to let go of the past and look toward the future." Something shifted in Owen's expression, relief perhaps, or approval. He nodded slowly. "I think that's a wise decision." "But it's not just about the ranch, Owen," Harriet continued, her heart beating faster as she ventured into territory she had carefully avoided until now. "It's about everything, about allowing myself to feel, to want things again." Owen set his cup aside, his full attention on her now. What things, Harriet? The question hung between them, laden with possibilities neither had dared acknowledge openly. Harriet found her courage faltering at the brink of confession. It's getting late, she said instead, rising from her chair. And you have a long ride back to the Circle H. Owen stood as well, disappointment briefly visible in his eyes before he masked it. Of course, thank you for the coffee. As he collected his coat and hat, Harriet felt the moment slipping away, the words she wanted to say remaining unspoken. It was safer this way, she told herself. Less complicated, less frightening. At the door, Owen turned to her one last time. Think about Henderson's offer, Harriet, and know that whatever you decide, you have friends who care about your happiness. I will, she promised. Good night, Owen. Good night, Harriet. As she watched him walk to the sleigh, Harriet was seized by a sudden certainty that if she let him leave now, something precious would be lost, a possibility, a beginning, a chance at happiness she had not dared to imagine since Thomas's death. Owen. She called, stepping onto the porch despite the cold. He turned, halfway to the sleigh, his face questioning in the moonlight. Harriet faltered, then gathered her courage. I'm not ready to say all the things I'm feeling, but I want you to know that I'm glad you came into my life. And I hope, whatever happens with the ranch, that you'll remain in it. Even in the dim light, she could see the smile that transformed his face. I plan to, Harriet Rowland. Wild horses couldn't drag me away. The simple declaration, spoken with such certainty, warmed Harriet more thoroughly than any fire. She smiled, a genuine expression that felt almost foreign on her face after so many months of grief and worry. Good, she said softly. Good night, Owen. Good night, Harriet, sweet dreams. As the sleigh pulled away, Harriet remained on the porch, watching until it disappeared from sight. For the first time in many months, the future seemed not just a burden to be endured, but a possibility to be embraced. And that, she reflected as she finally turned back to her cabin, was perhaps the greatest gift Owen Kincaid had given her hope. Christmas came and went, marked by simple celebrations and small gifts exchanged with neighbors, and the growing circle of friends Harriet found herself reconnecting with as she emerged from her isolation. Owen gifted her a beautiful hand-tooled leather journal, its pages blank and waiting for new stories to be written. She gave him a hand-knit scarf, the work of many secret evening hours when she should have been resting. As the new year of 1886 dawned, Harriet made her decision. She would accept Henderson's offer for the ranch and the position managing the Circle H accounts. The decision, once made, brought an unexpected sense of peace. It was time for a new beginning. The day she signed the papers in Finch's office, transferring ownership of the ranch to Henderson, Owen was there beside her, a steady presence offering silent support. Afterward, he suggested a celebratory dinner at the small hotel restaurant, the closest thing Eagar had to fine dining. To new beginnings, Owen proposed, raising his glass in a toast. To new beginnings, Harriet echoed, touching her glass to his. They talked easily throughout the meal, discussing the practical details of her transition to the Circle H and her new role there. The foreman's cabin, which Owen had been overseeing the repair of, would be ready for her occupation within the week. It's a good cabin, Owen assured her. Smaller than yours, but solid, and much closer to the main house, which will be convenient for your work with the accounts. Harriet nodded, grateful for his attention to these details. And what about you? Will you continue as foreman now that I'll be handling the books? Henderson seems pleased with my work so far, Owen replied. Though I've been thinking it might be time for me to put down those roots I mentioned when we first met. Oh, Harriet felt a flutter of anxiety. You're not planning to leave the area, are you? Owen smiled, reaching across the table to cover her hand with his. No, Harriet. I have no intention of leaving. Quite the opposite, in fact. The warmth of his hand on hers sent a pleasant shiver through Harriet, and she found herself turning her palm upward to interlace their fingers. It was a bold move for a woman still technically in mourning, but in that moment, Harriet felt the last shackles of her grief loosening their hold. I'm glad, she said softly. I've grown rather accustomed to having you around. Owen's eyes crinkled at the corners as his smile deepened. Have you now? Well, that's fortunate, because I've grown more than accustomed to being around you, Harriet Rowland. The week that followed was a whirlwind of activity as Harriet prepared to leave the ranch that had been her home for the past 3 years. Each item packed represented a memory, a piece of the life she had shared with Thomas, yet the process felt less like an ending than a transition. She was not abandoning these memories, but carrying them with her into a new chapter. Owen was a constant presence, helping with the heavier items, ensuring the livestock were properly transferred to the Circle H herds, making countless small gestures that eased her way. By the time the day of the actual move arrived, much of the emotional weight had been lifted through this gradual process of letting go. The foreman's cabin at the Circle H was indeed smaller than her own had been, but Owen and Henderson had worked together to make it welcoming. Fresh paint brightened the walls, new curtains hung at the windows, and a handmade quilt from Rosa adorned the bed. Most touching of all was the small desk positioned near the largest window, clearly intended for her work with the ranch accounts. "It's perfect," Harriet told Henderson as he showed her around. "Thank you for everything." "Glad to have you here, Mrs. Rowland," the old rancher replied gruffly, though pleasure at her approval was evident in his eyes. "Dinner's at 6 in the main house." "Rosa insists you join us tonight, no arguments," Harriet smiled. "I wouldn't dream of arguing with Rosa." Left alone to settle in, Harriet moved slowly around the cabin, placing her few personal items where they seemed to belong: Thomas's photograph on the small mantel, her mother's Bible beside the bed, the handmade ceramic jar that had held their sugar now positioned on the kitchen shelf. Small touchstones of continuity in a sea of change. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Opening it, she found Owen standing there, hat in hand, looking uncharacteristically nervous. "Everything to your liking?" he asked, glancing past her into the cabin. "Yes, very much so," Harriet assured him, stepping back to allow him entry. "You and Henderson thought of everything." Owen nodded, still seeming distracted as he paced the small space. "Good, good. I wanted it to feel like home for you." "It already does," Harriet said, watching him curiously. "Owen, is something wrong? You seem unsettled." He stopped pacing, turning to face her directly. "Not wrong, no, but there's something I need to say, and I'm finding the words more difficult than I expected." Harriet's heart began to beat faster. "What is it?" Owen took a deep breath, as if gathering his courage. "Harriet, these past months getting to know you they've meant a great deal to me, more than I can properly express." "They've meant a great deal to me too, Owen," Harriet said softly. "When we met, you were in a place of deep grief, fighting to hold on to the last connection to a man you loved deeply," Owen continued. "I respected that grief, that loyalty. I still do. But I've watched you gradually find your way back to life, to joy, to possibilities. And I've found myself hoping, perhaps selfishly, that I might be one of those possibilities." Harriet stood very still, her heart thundering in her ears as Owen stepped closer, taking her hands in his. "I know it may be too soon," he said, his voice low and earnest. "I know there may be those who would say the proper period of mourning hasn't passed. But life out here doesn't always follow the rules of polite society, and I find myself unwilling to wait any longer to tell you what's in my heart." With that, he slowly knelt before her, still holding her hands, his gray-blue eyes looking up into hers with an expression of such hope and vulnerability that Harriet felt tears spring to her eyes. "Harriet Rowland," Owen said, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his face. "I believe with all my heart that Thomas would want you to find happiness again. You once told me that love was over for you, that your heart had been buried with your husband. May I prove you wrong? May I show you that your heart is very much alive, capable of loving and being loved again." Tears spilled freely down Harriet's cheeks now, but they were tears of revelation, not sorrow. Owen was right, her heart was alive, had been awakening gradually under his patient care these past months. What she felt for Owen was different from what she had shared with Thomas, but no less real, no less precious. "Yes," she whispered, her voice breaking on the word. "Yes, Owen, you already have." Joy transformed his face as he rose, drawing her into his arms with gentle reverence. "I love you, Harriet," he said simply, holding her gaze. "I think I have since that day in the general store when you insisted on carrying your own packages." Harriet laughed through her tears, remembering the moment. "I was rather stubborn, wasn't I?" You still are, Owen replied, his smile tender. It's one of the many things I love about you. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away if she wished, Owen lowered his head until his lips met hers in a kiss that was both gentle and profound, a promise, a beginning, a declaration. When they finally parted, Harriet remained in the circle of his arms, feeling a sense of rightness, of coming home in a way that had nothing to do with the cabin around them. I love you too, Owen Kincaid, she said, the words feeling both terrifying and liberating as they left her lips. I didn't think it was possible to love again, but you've shown me that the heart is more resilient than I knew. Owen brushed a strand of hair from her face, his touch reverent. We'll take this as slowly as you need, Harriet. There's no rush. Harriet smiled, a newfound confidence in her expression. Actually, I think we've been taking it rather slowly already, don't you? I'm not as fragile as you might think. Owen's answering smile was both tender and determined. No, you're not fragile at all. You're the strongest person I know. But that doesn't mean you have to face life's challenges alone anymore. I'm beginning to understand that, Harriet admitted. It's a lesson I've been slow to learn. We have time, Owen assured her, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. All the time in the world. Spring arrived in the Arizona Territory with a riot of wildflowers and the promise of new beginnings. Harriet settled into her role at the Circle H with unexpected ease, her organized mind well suited to bringing order to Henderson's chaotic accounts. The old rancher often joked that she'd saved him more money in 3 months than his previous foreman had in 3 years. Her relationship with Owen blossomed in the open air of acceptance that Henderson's ranch provided. They took things slowly, as Owen had promised, enjoying the simple pleasure of spending time together without the pressure of Harriet's precarious situation hanging over them. They rode together on her days off, exploring the vast ranch lands that now included her former property. Owen showed her hidden meadows and secret waterfalls he had discovered in his explorations, while Harriet shared stories of the land she had come to love during her years with Thomas. It was during one such ride, as they picnicked beside a small stream that cut through what had once been her south pasture, that Owen broached the subject that had been on both their minds. Henderson asked me about my plans yesterday, he said, leaning back on his elbows in the spring grass. Seems he's been hearing rumors in town. Harriet raised an eyebrow, pausing in the act of slicing an apple. What sort of rumors? Oh, the usual kind that circulate when a handsome foreman and a beautiful widow spend a considerable amount of time in each other's company, Owen replied with a teasing smile. Handsome, is he? Harriet teased back, enjoying the easy banter that had developed between them. So I'm told, Owen laughed, then grew more serious. Henderson wasn't concerned about the rumors themselves. He actually seemed pleased, but he did ask if we had any plans he should be aware of, particularly regarding housing arrangements. Harriet set the apple and knife aside, her pulse quickening. And what did you tell him? Owen sat up, taking her hands in his. I told him that I was hoping to ask a certain lady a very important question, but that I wanted to do things properly. Properly. Harriet echoed, her voice barely above a whisper. Yes, properly, Owen confirmed, reaching into his pocket and withdrawing a small box. Which is why I'm asking you now, Harriet Rowland, if you would do me the very great honor of becoming my wife. He opened the box to reveal a simple but elegant ring, a small diamond flanked by 2 sapphires that reminded Harriet of Owen's gray-blue eyes. It's beautiful, she breathed, staring at the ring in wonderment. It was my grandmother's, Owen explained. I sent for it after Christmas when I knew. When I hoped we might reach this point. Harriet looked up from the ring to Owen's face, seeing there all the love and hope she felt reflected in her own heart. Thomas would always be a part of her, a cherished memory of her first love. But Owen, steady, patient, understanding Owen had shown her that life held second chances, that love could bloom again in a heart once broken. Yes, she said, her voice clear and certain. Yes, Owen Kincaid, I will marry you. Joy illuminated his face as he slipped the ring onto her finger, then pulled her into his arms for a kiss that spoke of all their tomorrows. The wedding took place in early June, a simple ceremony in Eagar's small church, followed by a celebration at the Circle H that brought together the entire community. Henderson gave the bride away, his gruff exterior softening as he placed Harriet's hand in Owen's with a whispered, "Take care of her, son." As they exchanged vows beneath a canopy of wildflowers Rosa and the ranch wives had arranged, Harriet felt a sense of completion, of circles closing and new ones beginning. She wore a dress of pale blue rather than traditional white, acknowledging her past while embracing her future. "I, Owen, take you, Harriet, to be my lawfully wedded wife," Owen's voice rang clear and confident in the small church. "To have and to hold from this day forward for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, until death parts us." As Harriet repeated the vows, her eyes never leaving Owen's, she felt Thomas's presence not as a ghost haunting her happiness but as a blessing upon it. She had loved him truly, and now she loved Owen with equal truth, different yet equally profound. "I now pronounce you man and wife," the minister declared. "You may kiss your bride." Owen's kiss was tender yet passionate, a promise of all they would share in the years to come. As they turned to face their friends and neighbors, Harriet caught sight of Mrs. Tanner dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief, Henderson beaming with paternal pride, and even banker Finch looking genuinely pleased. The celebration at the Circle H lasted well into the evening, with food, music, and dancing under the stars. Henderson had insisted on providing everything, declaring it his wedding gift to them along with the deed to a parcel of land 20 acres carved from what had once been Harriet's ranch, including the cabin she and Thomas had built. "For your future," the old rancher had said, pressing the deed into their hands. "Build something new there, something that honors the past but looks forward." Now, as the celebration wound down and they prepared to depart for the small hotel in Phoenix where they would spend a brief honeymoon, Harriet found herself overwhelmed with gratitude for the journey that had brought her to this moment. "Happy, Mrs. Kincaid?" Owen asked softly, coming to stand beside her at the edge of the festivities. Harriet leaned into his side, savoring the new name that represented her new beginning. "More than I ever thought possible again," she admitted. "And you, Mr. Kincaid?" "Any regrets about taking on a stubborn widow who insisted she could manage just fine on her own?" Owen's arm tightened around her waist as he pressed a kiss to her temple. "Only that I didn't drop by your ranch sooner. Think of all the time we could have saved." Harriet laughed, turning in his arms to face him fully. "I wasn't ready then. I needed that time to heal, to learn to stand on my own before I could learn to lean on someone else again." Owen nodded, understanding as always. "And now?" "Now," Harriet said, rising on tiptoe to kiss him, "now I'm ready for whatever adventures await us, as long as we face them together." Their life together unfolded with the changing seasons, each day bringing new challenges and joys. They rebuilt on the land Henderson had given them, constructing a home that incorporated elements of Harriet's original cabin, but expanded to accommodate the family they hoped to create. Owen continued as foreman of the Circle H, his steady leadership earning him Henderson's complete trust, while Harriet managed the ranch accounts with such skill that neighboring ranches began to seek her advice on their own financial matters. Together, they built a small but prosperous herd of their own, the foundation of what they hoped would one day be a legacy for their children. That dream began to take shape the following spring when Harriet discovered she was expecting their first child. The news, shared with Owen on a quiet evening by their own hearth, brought tears of joy to his eyes. "A family of our own," he whispered, his hand gently cradling her still flat stomach. "Harriet, you've made me the happiest man in the territory." Their son, Thomas Owen Kincaid, was born on a crisp October day in 1887, a healthy, robust boy with his father's gray-blue eyes and his mother's determined spirit. Holding him in her arms, Harriet felt the circle of life completing itself, the past and future merged in this tiny, perfect being. "He's beautiful," Owen said, his voice hushed with wonder as he gazed at their son, "just like his mother." Harriet smiled up at her husband, her heart so full it seemed impossible it had once been broken. "He's the best of both of us," she said. and a reminder that life always finds a way to renew itself, even in the most unexpected ways. As young Thomas grew, so did their family and their dreams. A daughter, Elizabeth Rose, joined them 2 years later, her arrival coinciding with Henderson's decision to retire and sell the Circle H to Owen and Harriet, who had proven themselves more than capable of running the ranch. Under their stewardship, the Circle H flourished, becoming one of the most successful operations in the Arizona Territory. They worked side by side, equal partners in every sense, their different strengths complementing each other perfectly. On the 10th anniversary of their wedding, Owen surprised Harriet with a special gift, a small silver locket containing miniature portraits of Thomas Rowland on one side and Owen on the other. To honor the past and celebrate the present, Owen explained as he fastened it around her neck. Two men who were blessed to love you, one in memory and one in life. Tears filled Harriet's eyes as she touched the locket, deeply moved by Owen's understanding and respect for the love she had shared with Thomas. "Thank you," she whispered, embracing him tightly, "for everything. For helping me find my way back to life when I thought all was lost. For proving me wrong when I said love was over for me." Owen held her close, his arms as strong and steady as they had been the day he'd found her stranded in the snowstorm all those years ago. "Thank you for allowing me the chance to prove it," he murmured against her hair, "for opening your heart to the possibility of loving again." As they stood together on the porch of the home they had built, watching their children play in the yard where once Harriet had stood alone contemplating an uncertain future, she reflected on the journey that had brought her here. Grief had once seemed an insurmountable mountain, loss a void that could never be filled. Yet life, with its infinite capacity for renewal, had found a way to bring joy again, to create new love where only memory had dwelled. The widow who had thought love was over had found a second chance at happiness, not by forgetting the past, but by honoring it while embracing the future. And the cowboy who had knelt before her, asking for the chance to prove her wrong, had given her the greatest gift of all, the courage to begin again. As the sun set over the Arizona hills, painting the landscape in shades of gold and amber, Harriet leaned into Owen's embrace, grateful for the unexpected turns in the trail that had led her home. "I love you, Owen Kincaid," she said softly, looking up at the face that had become as dear to her as life itself. "And I love you, Harriet Kincaid," he replied, his eyes reflecting all the years they had shared and all those yet to come, now and always. In that moment, with the laughter of their children carried on the evening breeze and the warmth of Owen's love surrounding her, Harriet knew with absolute certainty that love was never truly over. It simply found new ways to bloom, even in the wild and unpredictable landscape of life.